So hello everyone here in the room with us and the ones that are watching online. Welcome to this lunch briefing on China's challenges and opportunities facing Trump's US. My name is Anouk Buis. I'm a master's student in the International History and Politics department here at the Institute, and I'm very happy to present to you today our three panelists that are going to share with us their knowledge on this very relevant topic. Allowing us to analyze this topic from three different angles. So first, we will hear from Professor Kiely, who will share with us his insights from a historical perspective. Professor Kiely is a senior lecturer at the International History and Politics department, so also my professor here at the Institute. He is a historian of modern China with more than 4 decades of experience in and outside of the country. He was formerly co-director and associate professor of the Johns Hopkins University, Nanjing University for Center for Chinese and American Studies, as well as director and professor for the Center of China Studies at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Secondly, we will consider the economic aspects of the U.S.-China trade relations and its challenges under Trump with Professor Yuan Zi, who is an assistant professor of economics here at the Institute and a research affiliate at the Center for Economic Policy Research. Her research focuses on international trade, production networks, spatial economics, and the Chinese economy. And prior to joining the Graduate Institute, Professor Zi was an assistant professor of economics at the University of Oslo. And finally, we will hear from Professor Minhua Ling, who will dive into the sociocultural effects of Trump's second presidency, especially focusing on China's workers and youth. Professor Ling is an associate professor of anthropology and sociology here at the Institute, specializing in the areas of mobility, urbanization, food and health, socio-ecological sustainability, and sociocultural transformation in China and East Asia. Previously, Professor Ling was a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, as well as an associate professor at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. So we are going to dive right in with the talks of our panelists, which will be about 10 minutes each, and then we open up the discussion for a little Q&A session for the second half of the briefing. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Professor Kiely. Thank you.
I feel like you should all come closer, sit around. It's a small group. I think I have to stand here for the audience at home, but hello to everybody out there, and thank you for taking the time. I'm glad to have this chance to talk a bit to you, and we'd like to get to the questions as soon as possible so we can have a bit of an exchange. Speaking as a historian, well, let me talk about the most recent history, which is Geneva's next biggest moment in world and Chinese history, which you all know just occurred here recently. And what was that? This will go in the history books. Isaac?
Chinese trade deal with the...
Well, the lack of the deal. Let's put it that way. We have a big Geneva moment, and in the last time I was doing one of these talks about it a little over a month ago, some of this we were predicting right here, and that is to say that China was not going to back down, and China has stood up to Trump and proven in the Chinese terms that he is a paper tiger, and the U.S., this is a Maoist term, as many of you may know, the paper tiger idea that the U.S. is not a big, powerful state, and it can be backed down. That happened right here. The Chinese did not give up anything in that event. And so we can have several thoughts that come out of this, but from a historical perspective, as I argued the last time I was doing this here, it's not about the trade war from a historical perspective. We need to think more deeply than this rather superficial approach to things. And one way to do that is to use more of this lexicon of the Chinese Communist Party itself, which is useful because it's historically comparative, but it's also a language that continues to be used in a party that continues to exist and rule in China. So when we think about this longer-term shifts that may occur and problems, a classic term to use for the Chinese communists is, in doing any strategy, define first enemies and friends. You do that first. Who are your enemies and who are your friends? And there are very specific ways of talking about who an enemy is, who a friend is. Another terminology, and this is very clear, for instance, already in the wartime period that built, of course, the Communist Party in the mid-20th century and its power in China, is the notion of complexities. A complex society is a problem from the perspective of enemies and friends. Now, when you look into the issue of complexities and the wartime success of the Chinese Communist Party that made them powerful in the first place, you find that there was a huge amount of dealing with complexity that involved effectively adaptation, pragmatism, flexibility, figuring out who was on different sides and who you could work with. This is one of the major reasons that the party was so successful and came to power in 1949 as a result of the wartime period. My question then is, to what extent are we seeing that now? The Trump moment, maybe what's happened most since I last spoke, is seeing this huge amount of opposition that has arisen, rage all around the world. Countries that have never had to unite, we're not just talking about Europe here, but all around the world where people are facing the effect of these repeat and constant seeming assaults of the Trump government. They're uniting in ways that haven't occurred before. And of course, that's happening outside of state relations itself. If we're just looking at the US, for instance, the growing sense of groups that are unified, Canada being unified, for instance, lots of places that are now taking a view that is strongly in opposition and doing it in a unified way that had not previously been the case. To what extent, in this moment of opportunity that I spoke about the last time I was doing this, and to what extent can China take advantage of this? If they were operating in the mindset of a genuine global struggle and a struggle for their survival as they were in World War II, you would think they would be working on all kinds of different complex alliances to mobilize all of this around the world. Now, in theory, that is potentially going on, but that's not really what we're seeing. What we're seeing is something else. We're seeing efforts to find partners to oppose the U.S., Trump's U.S., but not really alliances on the one hand. And part of this also means that we are not seeing efforts that are going beyond what was, originally the agreements and situations that were causing problems for China in various parts of the world. Experts and the press usually call this China's assertivism, being assertive in the world. You could just say when you're a smaller country around China dealing with problems with China, you're often seeing something more than assertive. You're seeing something that can be very frightening and looks like a great power that is bullying people. Now, from the Chinese perspective, that will be understood differently. But in either case, what we're seeing is no pulling back on that level at all. So even when President Xi went around on his tour of Southeast Asia and so forth, he is not trying to bring deals to people that are offering a new socialism with a smiling face of any kind. There isn't anything of that type that we're seeing. So why is this? Why does this problem exist? Why is this overreach existing? Why this challenge is not being accepted? The opportunity seems there. So, I have a few minutes. I'm going to give you a thought, but I'm happy to discuss it with you. When I look at this, and I know that there are specialists within the Chinese government at a high level, and I know that there are people in the thinking sections of international relations in China who would also see this as a major opportunity for China that can be leveraged right now because of everything that Trump is doing. And that there should be various compromises, whether it's about Ukraine, whether it's about dealing with various smaller countries in Southeast Asia or so forth, where there are tensions that have been built up. There could be changes that are made that create better relations and real alliances against the Trump and the U.S. System. After all, the national rejuvenation project that Xi promises needs to build on something, but can it do it without these types of alliances? The question is, why not? I would say if you look very carefully at what President Xi is trying to do, and I'm trying to be as objective as possible, there were a lot of problems that he had to deal with coming into power in the 2010s. But I wouldn't say that his approach was just in one area. He's tried very multifaceted approaches to try to take on the various problems that he's been dealing with that were left for him, let's say, in the 2010s. But there's no avoiding the fact that the hugest investment and the hugest effort that has gone into this is effectively in security. And it's his notion of security, which is very well spelled out in 2014, is both internal and external together. That's the idea. This is not some secret point. This is a very, very well-known policy. Now, if you look at that over the last period, now more than 10 years, in which it continues, I would simply say you can't avoid the fact that that level of concern with securitization in so many different complex ways that is established internally and externally for China can only be developing on the basis of a strong sense of insecurity. And so that's the point I want you to throw out there for you primarily, is why at this moment in history, where China is more powerful, richer than it has been in its modern history, does it feel such great insecurity? Now, I could lecture for an hour on my explanation for why, when you sit in Beijing, you can feel a lot of insecurity. That's not what I'm going to do right now. Many of those topics are well known. But I'll say what really, if I were advising the Beijing government or talking to President Xi, what would concern me is the obvious point that the core of what has to be depended on, and this brings up another term that's important to Maoists. When you want to do something, you must depend on what? You must depend on the party. And the terms for this are discipline, organization, and unity. Comes up all the time historically, still used today. You can see it on the front page of the newspaper to this moment. So that's the part that the party should play. Does anyone know how large the Chinese Communist Party is today? The membership? 100 million people. This is a Leninist party with 100 million people. Can 100 million people ever be so unified? Can 100 million people play the Leninist role of unification and leadership that it must play? Effectively, this is a huge challenge. And you can see, just reading a Chinese newspaper today, you can see the constant efforts to attempt to address this in multiple ways. I'm almost there. My last point is you also and always needed, Mao said, power grows out of the barrel of a gun, and the party always has to have its hand on the gun. The party controls the military. And China's military today, the People's Liberation Army, is technically still a party military. It has not been formally defined as a national military. But if you follow this issue carefully too, you know there is anxiety in the top leadership, in the party, about their own army. Now, I'm not suggesting that, I'm not predicting any crisis or coup. It's nothing like that, as far as I'm concerned. But there is true lack of trust in the party to accomplish, let's put it simply this way, if you want to get into the details, I'll mention it. Their main expectations that the party leadership has for it internally and externally are questioned often, which is why so many people have been purged at a very, very high level in the military. So that's a big concern under this moment. Those are big, big challenges for this moment. To me, these things I'm talking about, not the trade war, are what really is going to be the questions of the next decade. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. We will now go ahead with Professor's presentation.
Okay, so hi, thanks for everyone coming. So now we're going to switch gears and talk about economics. And as a standard like econ-trained person, I cannot talk without figures, so we're going to see some numbers and figures. By the way, where's the... Oh, yeah, right, okay. So I'd like to first start, invite you to think a little bit out of the box, okay? So the title of the lunch briefing, I believe, is what attracts you here, is sort of like assuming that Trump's US is something that China has to face and respond to. But actually, to me, the causal correlation is actually the other way around. I personally feel like Trump got elected. It's per se is essentially, if not dominantly driven, but at least partially driven by the fact that the U.S. government in the past 20 years has been not doing a great job in coping with China's the opportunities and challenges brought by China's development process. Okay, so since my talk is going to be mostly on economics, mostly on trade, but with these big perspectives in mind, I actually want to share with you some long-run development trend and basic facts coming from the data, so that we could have a better understanding of the current situation in a bigger context. Okay, so this is what I'm going to do. The first point I try to make is that China actually began its trade liberalization well before its accession to the WTO. Okay, so we all know that China started opening up in 1978, but if you look at, for instance, the lower panel of the figure here, so essentially China's trade reform has already started in the 80s, and in the beginning of the 90s, the government already dramatically reduced the tariff barriers from around 40% to 15%, that is slightly lower than the average tariff imposed by global developing countries. And also during this period, essentially most of the non-tariff trade barriers were removed, and the entry for private capital to the trading sector was also opened. And most importantly, before China's accession to the WTO, there's also quite a lot of domestic trade frictions. Can you imagine in that time, actually, different Chinese provinces, they're imposing tariffs on each other. If you are trading some alcohols from one Chinese province to another, you need to face something about 30, 40% of tariffs. So all those was massively removed. And together of this, of course, is also combined with institutional changes. Thousands of regulations dealing with business, not only for international firms, but also mostly for domestic firms, was removed or modified during this period, essentially made the business environment, at least in the legal standing perspective, very close to the international standard for China. That's actually the precondition for countries accepted China to join the WTO. So story in short, most of the hard reforms was actually done before the accession, and that is also could explain why, if you look at the trade figure on the upper panel, you see that there's a significant increase of trade values, both in import and import. If I log it, you will see the growth rate is almost constant. You don't really see a significant jump right at China's accession to the WTO. Okay, so this said, how about China and relationship with the US in terms of trade? Okay, so indeed both countries are important trading partners to each other, but if you look a little bit at the details, the story might not look exactly as what you think. So again, let's start looking from the lower panel over here. Here, what we plot here is essentially U.S. share of import from China and also export to China. As you can clearly see from this plot, over years, essentially U.S. was exporting and importing more and more goods from and to China, not only in terms of values, but in terms of the relative importance in its total trade. Okay, so to put it simply, China has become a more and more important trading partner to the US. But how about from the perspective of China? As you can see from the upper panel there, nothing changed. So US has been an important trading partner, but we don't really see a significant increase. But if anything, after 2005, there's actually a slight decline. Okay, so this is in terms of relative importance in terms of trading partnership. But I also want to remind you that Since 2006, China has been strategically reducing its reliance on trade in driving economic growth. So China's trade openness, measured by total trade divided by its GDP, went from, at its peak days, over 100% to about 20% in 2025. Okay, what does that mean? That means by the time of 2025, the US export to China as a share of China's total GDP is actually less than 3%. Okay, so story in short, important trading partners, but not as big as you think. So that is about trade. How about FDI? We know that whenever we're talking about international economics, one important thing is international flow of goods, and another thing is about international flow of capital. Actually, for FDI, you see a very similar picture. So since China's liberalization, mostly driven by its internal reforms, and the inward FDI has been growing very quickly. And again, joining WTO is not giving you any significant jump or increase of this trend. It's just a continuation, increase of inward FDI and a continuation of the opening up of the economy. Okay, and how about the U.S. role played in this? Okay, maybe to your surprise, U.S. is not a very big country in terms of doing investment in China. I'm giving you the figure in 2023, but this is actually the case for all years, even if you date the data back to the 90s and 80s. Okay, so as you can see from the Apple panel I'm showing you a pie chart, but essentially if you look at what is the share of realized FDI value in 2023 coming from the North America, it's a pretty small share. It's like something about 2%. Okay, and we can also further break this down into countries. And in the lower panel, where I circled United States in red, so essentially the size of the circle is showing you in terms of the value of the FDI. And just to do a comparison, you can see like U.S. is actually, in terms of the FDI values, it was only 2/3 of what China receiving from Singapore, and maybe like slightly better or slightly bigger than what China has been receiving from Taiwan, but Taiwan is a very small region. It's the size of it is like a French department. Okay, so again, story in short, we can see U.S. as a single nation is a key investor, but it's definitely far away from dominant in. If you are a Chinese Ministry of Commerce, you think about who are the important trading partners or investment partner. U.S. is not going to be on the top. And then, who are the important ones for China? Do you have any guess? Is that the European Union? Well, it's kind of like already showing there in the figure, right? All the details are in the data. It's ASEAN countries. It's Southeast Asia and more broadly defined global South. This is where the important trading relationships are for China. So ASEAN, by the way, ASEAN has already been the top Chinese trading partners for over years, and the trade relationship is continuing deepening. This is essentially the reality we have to take. Okay, so this said, given these economic fundamentals, I guess it's not very hard for us to guess what could be China's policy reaction to all these uncertainties, no matter it's on economics or beyond economics, brought by Trump's administration. Actually, the Chinese government officials and deputy of NPC has been really saying this over and over in different ways and in different languages, but I somehow think we didn't really listen to them very carefully. The general reaction, to put it simply, is we're going to continue to do our own things. There's problems internally China has to cope with, the reform or the transition to the market economy, the correction of regional inequality, all those kind of big, important tasks for the government is not finished. And those reform is going to continue. It's just like how China started this reform. It was internally driven. It was not externally posed. Like some of the other developing countries like India or Argentina and Chile, it's because of a domestic crisis, and therefore, in order to get money from IMF, they have to liberalize the economy, liberalize the finance sector. That is not the case of China. It was largely internally driven. And therefore now, with some uncertainty externally, that big picture or big direction is not going to change. So that's why we're going to see that essentially if you read very carefully about the Chinese government report, well, not only this year's or from the previous years, you are going to see that the Chinese government is going to continuing boosting its domestic demand. It's going to continue invest on education and invest on high-tech sectors. And there's going to be continuation of economic integration, not only with its major trading partners, but also within the country. There's, this is a country size-wise, I tend to tell my students, 3 times the size of European Union. So it's a big country. Therefore, in order for things to shift from the east of China to the west, there's still much things you can do to reducing trade barriers. So all those things is going to continue. Should we think them as a reaction to Trump's policy? Well, it's kind of, in some ways, a solution, but I think it's more like it's a continuation of the long-run development strategy of the government, and I think they are on the right track. Okay, so this is all I want to share with you. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Zi. So the last presentation will be by Professor Ling about sociocultural impacts.
Thank you all for coming. And just to continue my colleagues' kind of comments on the continuation of both in terms of historical development and economic policy, I would say the labor conditions that has been widely perceived, to be very unfriendly to workers in China also is a kind of a long-term continuation practice. Of course, newspapers today are all talking about how the U.S. tariffs, as it stayed at 30%, are going to definitely, engender high unemployment rate in China, and it's expected that. Because China's exportation to the U.S. will have, and then, the expected a loss of up to 6 million manufacturing jobs in China, depending on how you calculate it, so that China's workers will definitely have much less leverage to bargain over their labor condition, and you will see increasing trend of informalization of work in China. But this actually happened before Trump 2.0, because since the 2010s, the rising kind of a labor cost as perceived by investors, both domestic and foreign investors, has already been, driving factories to move to Southeast Asia and even Mexico for cheap labor. So Chinese workers has constantly been under assault, and the labor condition within China hasn't been improved that much, despite the miraculous economic growth in China in the past 3 decades. And because I have been researching on, rural to urban migrant workers, so when I'm reading news about Trump's tariffs, I cannot help constantly thinking about what would happen to them. And due to time limit, today I will just highlight the gender aspect of the impacts of Trump's U.S. upon Chinese workers. Because as you may notice that the tariffs, the industries that are most affected by U.S. tariffs, including textile, garment, electronics, and the toy manufacturing, are highly femininized. So it's mostly manned by female workers, and mostly female workers from the countryside to cities. So and even during the Biden administration, there's already tariffs against Chinese electronics and machinery. So a 2019 survey of export-oriented factory in Guangdong shows between 10 to 20% of labor, like a job cut, within reduction following these U.S. tariffs. So now, see, with the 30% tariffs, we are going to see even more cuts, and Chinese women, especially rural female workers, will be significantly affected by this. And what does that mean? Well, for rural women, most likely they will be forced to return to the countryside. where they will resume or expected to resume household work, which are unpaid domestic labor. And that will significantly reduce their economic independence. In the early economic reform era, we're seeing like millions of Chinese young female working in factories in the Pearl River Delta, making wages, sending like money back to their family, but meanwhile also kind of put on learning the new consumer. Put on new clothes, learning urban consumer habits, and kind of feel empowered. So there was a kind of a moment. There are moments for Chinese women to feel empowered through economic reform, but increasingly this bleak employment kind of prospect for Chinese women raised a lot of challenges for them. And this going back, when unemployment unequally falling and disproportionately falling on women, this will reinforce the gendered division of labor, and especially in families where both spouses work, then the women will be more likely to drop out of the labor market and go to the villages to handle household. And this really send alarms about the China's kind of recent feminist kind of movement, because this will further reduce render the efforts of Chinese feminists weak, and especially this unemployment trend facing Chinese women has also to be understood with the China's demographic challenges. That is the low fertility rate amid today's rapidly aging society in China. So you have actually the Chinese government in face of this trend has not only drastically abandoned the one-child policy in the country, in the cities, but also has exerted a lot of pressures socially, policy-wise, to force women to return to the family. And that, raise a lot of questions about what the Chinese women do. And so, secondly, for Chinese youth, what it means, because when talking about the high employment rate, newspaper today and kind of a daily conversation talk a lot about urban youth kind of unemployment rate. In 2023, the official statistics of unemployment rate among youth are more than 23%, which triggered the Chinese government to stop releasing such statistics afterwards. But there's a widespread kind of impression that the Chinese youth, especially recent college graduates, are having increasing hard time finding jobs. And the social media discourse, are very much emphasizing on urban youth kind of resentment and kind of reaction towards that. But I would like to say that as a kind of researcher on rural to urban Chinese migrant workers, the kind of the labor condition they have faced has been actually consistently kind of bad since like the 1980s, and they have much less voice in both Chinese media and the Western media, while the urban youth in China today like to talk a lot about the tangping, lying down, referring to passive work and the withdrawing efforts in both schoolwork and kind of jobs. This is more kind of like in an urban village, like urban privilege for those whose parents can afford to support them. But for migrant youth, especially second generation rural to urban migrant youth, whose parents are not able to afford them, urban a large and support their urban living, then this the tangping discourse actually is not that relevant to them, and the difficulties they are going to face is much more tremendous. And this also has to do with this kind of the youth sentiment, or kind of towards the politics. There's kind of as mentioned by the moderator, I'm going to talk briefly about, what American dream versus Chinese dream means today in China. And this tariff war and the kind of, increasing intention definitely has been changing Chinese youth perception of the American dream. You can see growing disenchantment among Chinese youth as expressed on social media as well as daily life with the American dreams that used to inspire millions of Chinese youth to study abroad, to consume American cultural products, and to participate in the social imagination of a global village and embrace Western, more liberal kind of values. But today, there are increasing negative views online as well as offline, and there's a strong, they often describe the American dream as somewhat outdated and unattainable. You might have seen on YouTube, those AI-generated videos, right? Making mockeries of American workers working overweight and working along assembly lines. So this adjustment will have significant impact in the long run. Because when I grew up in the 90s in China, I remember, we watch American TV shows, not only to learn English, but to kind of copy the lifestyle, rethinking about a lot of values about the family, about social, relationship and the social values. But today, when I talk to my young cousins and the students, they seem to be much less curious about what America, a society is, what Western in general, thinking. And on top of that, Chinese patriotic education, especially in the past decades under the Xi's government, has managed to various degrees to produce a much more patriotic and to some extent a nationalistic kind of younger generation who are more critical of Western values and more inclined to support domestic brands and domestic opportunities. So there are a lot of supports among the Chinese citizens, including the youth, even though they suffer from higher unemployment rate, for the Chinese government's policy and the decision to kind of stand up against Trump. And it has been seen as a good thing. And they are, and a lot of them are willing to buy Chinese goods and to consume domestically to support. And the discourse of eating bitterness, 吃苦, become which kind of for a while was believed to be rejected because Chinese people are enjoying much more material comforts and deserve to enjoy more comfort. Now seem to resurface in social media and the Chinese official discourse, saying that we Chinese people would only succeed by eating bitterness. But the question is this eating bitterness kind of Chinese dream going to sail for long? We still don't know, and I'm very happy to kind of, have an open discussion with you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our three speakers. So I'll open up the floor for any questions from the audience. If you have a question, you can just raise your hand. I think we have microphones going around. And can I just ask you to briefly present yourself before you ask your question very concisely so that we can take as many as possible. And it's also possible to ask questions online, so I'll have a look if there are any here. And we have the first question. So.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I'm a PhD student in IRPS. And so we have seen that China is concerned with the notion of security as it's trying to reduce the dependence from abroad by expanding domestic demand and technological upgrading. But also it's trying to find in some specific dossier also a collaboration, both especially with the Global South, but also with other kind of players, at least to face the economic challenges posed by Trump. So my question will be, we can imagine a future where in some sectors where China perceives the vulnerability, but also where other countries perceive the same vulnerabilities, to have more a deglobalized economy, while instead in sectors where there is not this notion of vulnerability and insecurity, then still a collaboration and an economic integration towards a selective globalization scenario?
Okay, I can take that. Right. So I guess I want to maybe first by saying some facts. If you look at country size, economic size, and its relative trade openness, it typically is going to see a strong negative correlation, meaning that when country is growing economically, by nature, like the more you produce, you're going to be less rely on foreign goods. It's just because of the sheer size of the economy. So imagine if the whole globe is a country as a whole, you don't have any trade because there's zero trading partner out there. So it's purely statistics. So in some way, if you have China by its sheer population having trade openness over 100%, it's actually not good for the economy, and it's also not good for the rest of the world, actually. And regarding, so I more see that it's just a very natural structural transformation, and it's good that the Chinese government is kind of like seeing that and actively sort of like repositioning over years, and therefore the adjustment is less painful for its domestic people, but also less painful for the rest of the world. And that is one point I want to say. And the other one is national security. I agree in some sense, but I would more put it in a more neutral term. In any economic collaboration or specialization, whether it's between countries or within a country, we have something called supply chain resilience. In the sense, like nowadays, for most of the goods, you cannot produce it within one factory. You need to have collaboration between factories and firms or entities, no matter it's cross the border or within the border. Of course, one thing is to pursue efficiency, but you also want to be resilient to unexpected shocks, no matter the shock is coming from the policy perspective or it's coming from environmental shock, natural disaster, and so on and so forth. Okay, so if, for instance, any nation's government should always think very carefully, let's say when you deepen the international collaboration for what is essential for your own country, for instance, no matter it's your core industry, like for instance, Cuba, I guess that will be the sugar industry, and in some places to protect your agriculture farmers, this should be in the government's decision function. To what extent? I feel like the word of national security has been kind of like overused in some way, because many industries which from the economic perspective are not about national security, for instance, shipbuilding industry, it's a pretty matured industry in the sense there's no any technology advancement, or it's not a sector with a lot of R&D is going on. It's also not really a sector which has too much of like the strategic importance in the sense the building capacity exists in U.S. islands, but then for some reason all of a sudden shipping industry, for example, was labeled as national security, and therefore the U.S. government want to impose like high fees for any ship which are made in China, not even with a Chinese flag. And so I would say I would be very careful to think about what is truly important for the people, like in terms of supply chain resilience, and what is really like sometimes in media talking about national security, because I think these two things are different. And I feel what you actually more thinking is actually on the formal.
Thank you. Any other questions? We have one here.
Well, thank you so much for this really wonderful sharing. I present a teacher from China. I'm a teacher from Renmin University of China. And this question is actually about concern of my students in America. I think this question for Professor Yang and Professor Lin, because recently my students in US, especially in Harvard University, they ask about what they should do after this policy, recently. So I heard they have 3 choices. One is transfer to some other university, not Harvard and more, and some will book a flight back to China out of their research plan. And also some students actually have no choice. They're still waiting for something happen. But now they are very anxious and very angry, actually, and they post something on the social media. So as a parent, also teacher, I really hope to know your suggestion to these young students. Especially, I know, Professor Yang, you were in China before, and you also have wonderful students. The research is on how students of China in America. So I also know Lin from Hong Kong Chinese University. So I hope to ask your canned suggestions for these students in America. Thank you.
So thank you, Professor Guo. I can't give you a academic or professional response. I can give you a very personal one. You're talking about my hometown, and actually I grew up on that campus. So, I feel extremely strongly about it. I'm incredibly embarrassed for what has happened, and I can tell you the feeling in that place and in communities that are connected to it, which are extremely wide, are powerfully among those who I mentioned who are mobilized to do something about this. It's an absolute disgrace, of course, and it's also a pointless attack on people without any reasoning. I can tell you, since I have classmates and former teachers and so forth who are working there, that Harvard University is doing a lot, and they have a lot of capacity to do things to minimize this and to fight back, and hopefully this will be prevented, first of all, but that lots of things will be attempted to prevent this from happening, and alternatives will be found. So people are working, Americans and Chinese, and of course a place like that is a fully international community. People everywhere are working on this. This is just one of those areas. I'll just leave that. Professor Ling can speak more to Chinese students' perspective.
Well, Trump's kind of latest attack on Harvard's international students definitely are not helping especially Chinese students' growing negative view about U.S. And recent survey done in February after Trump got elected again among U.S. campuses already show that among the largest 2 international groups, Indian and American students, both groups demonstrate quite like a high percentage of negative views of the U.S. Like China, only about 26% Chinese students have positive views about the U.S. universities, and you can see from statistics, admission and enrollment kind of statistics in the academic year of 2023 to 2024, there's already 4% decrease of Chinese students from the previous year, and this declining trend is, predicted to continue. And on the other hand, China's domestic, I think, atmosphere and the recent policies are also trying to pull the Chinese talents within China, right? And you can see from news reports as well as our own conversation with our students, top students in top universities are now increasingly tend to stay within China. They will try to stay on, pursue higher, graduate degrees within the top 20 universities in China in fear of not only U.S. uncertainty and U.S.-China politics, as well as rising sentiment against overseas Chinese students within China, because there are recent high-profile entrepreneur in China saying that overseas Chinese students are not trustworthy. Of course, that's an individual case, but because she's a very high profile, CEO of the public listed company, one of the biggest exporters of electronics. So this kind of a conversation are sending certain signals to Chinese youth as well as their parents. But of course, with that said, from the readings from among international Chinese students in the U.S., those who choose to stay or are now working very hard to build alliance, to share information, to seek legal support. Some of them still report belief in the American kind of legal system or kind of its strong value on human rights. So we will continue to see this kind of diverging passes among Chinese youth. But I think the uncertainty both abroad and in U.S. and within China is going to keep more and more Chinese youth within Chinese kind of system.
Thank you so much.
Yes, we have a question up there.
Thank you for the wonderful presentations. I'm a PhD student in international law. My question concerns international cooperation and development. The focus here is on US and China, but as the two countries are the two biggest economies, and as we know, there has been a lot of acts within Trump administration with regard to international organizations, with regard to international development. And as the topic here is the challenges, opportunities. And as Yang also mentioned, there's an internal, maybe insecurity, I would say, maybe uncertainty in China with regard to this situation in international cooperation and development. What would you think are the challenges and opportunities for China, and are there also uncertainties for China towards the international cooperation scope field? Thank you.
Well, thank you for the question. I think there are enormous opportunities for China, but it demands a lot of change in perspectives on how to handle those opportunities. Now, Professor Tzu pointed out how much China has accommodated, how much it has changed, which is absolutely right, to have become the country it has in the 20th and 21st centuries. But in this moment, if you simply look at the question of China's plan to be a leading or perhaps the leading power in the world, many things were still in the way of that, not just in terms of economics, even prior to all the development of Trump's efforts and so forth, but at many levels. Developing universities at the level of Harvard University, for instance. China has poured money into top universities, has great universities, but I think almost all specialists would have agreed to a few years ago it wouldn't quite be at the level of quality or possibility that you'd have, which is why many Chinese university students were going abroad, maybe why you also came abroad, right? But that moment has a potential to change now, right? Doors are opening. Can the Chinese state address this? Can it play a part in this? Frankly, my own view is that if you left this to the Chinese people and the American people and people around the world without so much state involvement, a lot of things would happen as they've been going on for the last 30, 40 years, which has showed an amazing capacity for people at all different types of levels, not at the top level of the governments, or even at state and local governments, which have also been very involved in this, but institutions, schools, all sorts of different types of businesses, NGOs. Up until the period of the 2010s, NGO work on development issues, for instance, was enormous in China and highly cooperative. So the potential for all of that, I don't think is lost. The question is, you're asking. I'm giving I'm not saying, as a historian, I'm not going to predict a bad outcome or any outcome. I'm simply saying what I would be worried about are the things that I talked about. Will those efforts to so secure China internally and externally. The effort, the investments that have to go in, the choices that are put into that, will it hold China back from the opportunity of reaching out the way it could? And there are moments right now when it looks like that, but things evolve, so we don't know which direction it will go. And when you talk about those opportunities, a huge number of opportunities are being created by the fact, of course, that the U.S. is withdrawing. Take foreign aid. China has been working as a major foreign aid player since the Maoist period, right? And yet the opportunities for playing a role in foreign aid without major competitors like the U.S. but involved, and playing a bigger role in that, having more influence, expanding its soft power and so forth, it's there right now in a different way. Will that happen or not? So we'll see.
Maybe just to add to that, like I guess you see this problem from two perspectives. One is on the existing international order, and B on the money or the economics which finance and the maintenance of the international order or maintenance of the running of those organizations. On the side of like if just talking about institutions, well, I would just use WTO or UNITC as example because those are the institutions I know relatively well, and I have tons of my friends and peers working there. Actually, even since like 2010-ish, the attention has been there in the sense like U.S. has been increasingly not happy about how the rules was. How things was working, even though things are following the rules, but they may not always align with the U.S. interest. In WTO, for instance, the dispute settlement typically, in many cases, when U.S. are not happy about certain, for instance, like certain countries export, and U.S. is putting like a tariff on it, like saying anti-dumping, but when the case was brought to WTO's dispute settlement, the judge typically is going to rule against the U.S. and say, hey, there's no real dumping, okay? And because of this, U.S. has already been attempting to move away since that time. And if you really talk to like the delegates or people working in WTO for a long time, China has been the one mostly following the rules and are the one trying to maintain the system. So I think it's very clear, like for most of the countries, it's a U.S.-led rule, or like the international order was largely. Or U.S. was a significant contribution for the fact that we have an international order. It's a great achievement, actually. And it's much better to have some frame there so that you can continue to talk and get things done than move away from it. So I think that consensus is still there despite all the things hitting the news. Most of the countries are trying to maintain the international order, trying to maintain how things works in UN, how things works in WTO, and so on and so forth. And then maybe in a positive way, we're going to be in a world which are actually more multilateralism. I think maybe to some extent, Yang could correct me, after the fall of the Iron Curtain, we're a little bit like in a multinational world, but led by one superpower. Depending on how you think about it, maybe you think it's a true multilateralism, maybe it's not quite. So maybe we have a chance to move to a world where we have multilateralism, but there are multiple, not one superpower, but multiple big power is going to balancing and counting on each other, and hopefully the small countries' voice could be more heard and their interest could be more taken care of. On the economic side, where there's money coming from, the U.S. retreat also means like UN is not going to get as much funding as before. U.S. has not paid the membership fee to WTO yet, and all this is kind of like in real day life affecting the operation of those institutions. So the money has to come in from somewhere, and that is a more acute challenge we're facing now. So on the other side, I'm positive. On the money side, I think that's a problem to be solved, but it's not. In the end of the day, it's money, so it's not anything can be solved with money. Typically, it's not a big problem. So.
Maybe Professor Ling, you have any last words?
Just a quick note on the aid. While U.S. withdraw from the foreign aid, a lot of us, some people are speculating whether China will step up to fill in the vacuum. But currently, most Chinese foreign aid are very much operating in different realms that U.S. aid are not touching. Chinese aid, foreign aid are very much in infrastructure construction and post-disaster kind of a construction. So it's kind of more likely, kind of as Professor Zi mentioned, it's a kind of a more parallelly competing models, even in terms of foreign aid. Whether smaller countries can leveraging in this kind of bilateral kind of competition, this might something that we need to wait and see.
Okay, I think with this nice words, we will conclude our lunch briefing for today. Thank you again to our panelists for their time and their sharing their wisdom, and also to the audience for your interest. And I hope everyone has a good rest of the day. Thank you.